You're listening to Black Music Scene, a show where we explore the incredible journeys, challenges, and triumphs of Black orchestral musicians who've dedicated their lives to the craft, breaking barriers and defining what it means to be a virtuoso. We are here to celebrate and archive the awe-inspiring stories of our living legends in Black classical music. On today's episode, we're joined by violinist, writer, and cultural historian Rosalyn Story. For more than 30 years, Rosalyn has performed with the Fort Worth Symphony, but her artistry doesn't stop there. She's a novelist, a journalist, and a passionate keeper of Black musical history. Whether chronicling the legacy of opera trailblazers like Sissieretta Jones, or guiding students through the soundscape of African American music, Rosalyn brings a rare kind of dual fluency, one grounded in both performance and storytelling. In this episode, she shares how a 75-cent violin class in Kansas City sparked a lifelong passion, what it meant to be the only Black musician in the room, and how music, especially jazz, continues to sustain her in moments of grief and resistance. It's a conversation about resilience, reverence, and the many ways we remember who we are, through sound, through stories, and through one another. This is Black Music Scene, cultivating community, lifting our voices, and telling our stories.
My name is Rosalyn Story. I'm a violinist with the Fort Worth Symphony, and I am the daughter of Algram and Mabel Story of Kansas City, Kansas. I was raised in the Black CME church in Kansas City, Kansas. And as you know, most Black churches were then and probably still are very musical. And I grew up singing in the choir, but there was a woman who came and sat next to the choir. And she would pull out her music stand, an older lady. Her name is Mrs. Hunt. And I would see her sitting there. She'd pull out her clarinet, and she had like a little wire music stand, and she would play along with the choir. And now looking back years later, I thought she really was not a very good player. But I just fell in love with that clarinet, and I thought, oh, that's so cool. And so I wanted to play something that was the only instrument that I'd seen at the time, besides the organ and the piano at the church. So I thought, I want to play that. So I asked my parents for a toy clarinet for Christmas, and they couldn't find a toy clarinet, so they got me a little trumpet, and it just wasn't the same. I just wanted that clarinet. At any rate, I started playing violin pretty late. You consider that pretty late now, 10 years old, because a member of the Kansas City Philharmonic Orchestra, it was called that at the time, now it's Kansas City Symphony, came around to our grade school and was offering violin class. And the class included the violin and instruction. I think it was 75 cents per month. So I jumped at that. We couldn't really afford private lessons. I really wanted to play piano. I wanted to do anything I could do in music, clarinet, piano. It's funny because I didn't really have, except for the church, didn't really have much background except for my parents loved jazz. And Kansas City has always been historically a big jazz town. It's the home of Charlie Parker. Mary Lou Williams had made a big impression when she lived there for many years. And just a lot of people came through there and played. And I went to the high school that Charlie Parker went to, Sumner High School. So there was a lot of jazz legacy in Kansas City. My parents would go to these parties where there were great live musicians coming through and performing. So I absorbed all that with the church, the gospel in the church and the spirituals and jazz and the blues and all of that in Kansas City. And I just wanted to do something musical. I did have some musicians in my family, but they were church singers. I had two aunts who had beautiful voices. And then one of my uncles was a jazz saxophone player, but I really never heard him play because he stopped doing that and started, getting he was on the road a lot with that. That didn't set well with his marriage. So he had to stop that, and he ended up, I think, delivering mail or something, like working for the post office. At any rate, so that was my background in terms of the things that I was absorbing, exposed to. Certainly watched a lot of things on television and on the radio. There were jazz stations in Kansas City. I would hear Miles Davis on the radio. I wanted to play trumpet and actually did play trumpet for a little bit in the marching band. One winter marching was enough for me, so I stopped that. But then I kept the violin going, and I did play piano for a little bit, but I was already so deep into the violin that I joined what really changed my life was getting into the Youth Symphony in Kansas City. Youth Symphony in Kansas City opened up all kinds of musical avenues for me. I had seen pictures of England in my geography book, and I wanted to go there. And so the Youth Symphony of Kansas City was going to spend about 3 weeks in England. And this happened about maybe a year or so after I joined, or maybe a few years after that. Before I knew it, I was in England and I was going to the Royal Albert Hall, hearing concerts and doing all these things that a little Black kid from a small town in Kansas City, Kansas had no right to think in those terms at that time. At the time that I grew up. So that's basically it. And then, the rest, I ended up majoring in music with a minor in literature, minor in English, major in music, minor in English, and at the University of Missouri, Kansas City Conservatory. Then joined the Kansas City Symphony, and then subsequently the Tulsa Symphony, and then Fort Worth Symphony.
Talk to me about your relationship with the violin. What drew you, and what kept you coming back to the instrument?
Well, the instrument, it's full of so many challenges. I mean, they give you 4 strings and some wood, and they expect the world. They expect millions of notes on. It's a very basic and very simple instrument, but there's so much room for development and complexity. And I mean, you can, millions of notes, and you can do anything with. You can bend those notes, you can shape them, you can vibrate them, you can do all kinds of things. And the challenges remain to this day. I mean, you never stop learning how to play that instrument. Now, I think every instrument, and probably your instrument included, if you talk to that person who plays it, they would say, well, I'm still learning. But I think for the violin, because it's just so complex and so demanding, and maybe even finicky because of the fact that it's made of wood and you have to deal with the weather and all these things too. You have to make your own intonation. You have to, I know that woodwind players and even, brass players, you have some latitude in terms of how you can shape that pitch to tune the instrument. But for the violin, you have where you put your finger down, that's a pitch, You have to make your own sense of pitch, and you have to be able to hear to be able to do that. So, dealing with pitch, dealing with the dexterity of the physical dexterity that's required of playing that instrument, there's just a lot to it. So I kept coming back to it. I thought it was a beautiful sounding instrument. And I would hear the great violinists. At the time, I think I loved the David Oistrakh and Zeno Francescatti and some of the older players like that, and Fritz Kreisler, and then, of course, Isaac Stern later on. And all these players sounded different to me. And I don't know that that's so much true these days. When I hear violinists now coming out of the major music conservatories, there is a similarity in their sound that didn't happen in the early days in the 70s of music, and and coming out of universities and conservatories. Each of those violinists that I mentioned had a signature sound that you could just hear. That is Isaac Stern. That can't be anybody else. That's David Oistrakh. That is Heifetz. They sound like no other. It's almost like singing. When you hear an artist sing, you think, well, that can't be anybody else but Kathleen Battle. I know what she sounds like. There may be imitators, but there's only one person who sounds like Jessie Norman or Kathleen Battle. The violin, I think, and at least in those days when I was coming up, was very much like that. You stamped it with your own personality, your own sound. And I think that was part of it for me, too. I'd like to make my own sense of tone. I loved vibrato. That was one of the things that I worked and still work at today. I felt like vibrato had a sense of the personality of the player in it, and that roundness and those colors come out in the vibration. And so that's kind of what I think drew me to it.
I'd love to hear about your early inspirations. Who played a significant role in you becoming a musician?
Well, the person who's responsible, I think, primarily for me becoming a musician, his name was Leon Brady. I say was. He just passed away yesterday at the age of 92. He was my junior high school teacher, an orchestra leader, and by the time I got to high school, he had been appointed to teach at that high school. He was a wonderful motivator of young people. He believed that we could do anything. And they were talking about a Black neighborhood, a Black school, junior high school and high school, that was probably the poorest school in the district. Certainly had a lot of talent in terms of the faculty, but there was not a lot of money in that Black community. But he made us believe that we could do absolutely anything. It didn't matter how late you start. Doesn't matter what kind of instrument you have, whatever you have, if you work hard and you believe, he taught us that we could do just about anything. And he was able to get the jazz band to compete in Paris, France. And this was like unheard of. Now, I wasn't with the jazz band, but I had friends there. I remember them going to France and doing a competition and coming home with the top prize. And this was like an all-Black orchestra of these kids from the hood, and just, setting the community in Paris, music community, on fire in those days. So that was Leon Brady. That's the most important person I can think of, and certainly I'm feeling a lot about that now because he just passed away yesterday. He had us playing music that was well above we were like just kids, like we're 11, 12, 13 years old playing the Marriage of Figaro Overture. Now, very slow tempo, but we did do it. And the 1812 Overture. I mean, stuff like that, these, kids who just been playing a couple, 2 or 3 years on their instruments, trying to play. But he just believed we could do anything. He believed we could do things that we didn't think we could do. But he kept saying that over and over. You can do anything you want to do. And people always say that, but they don't really, number one, necessarily mean it with the same force that they're living. And they don't necessarily have a way of saying that convinces you that it's true. But they may say the words, but do they really communicate that in a way that you can actually grab hold of and say, well, I think he might be right. Maybe I can do, Leon Brady had that ability. And I think of my teacher in London as being extremely important. Her name was Kato Havas. And I studied with her for 3 consecutive summers when I was in my early 20s after college. I was already playing with the Kansas City Symphony. But I would take off in the summers and go and just to get some more training so I just could be better, you know. And also, she had a way of playing that was a method that would alleviate some of the pain and suffering of playing an instrument that is not ergonomic. The violin is full of contortionist moves and just pronating this and that. And just, you know, as a result, we have a lot of neck and shoulder and, you know, injuries and pain. She had a way of playing that alleviated some of that. So I went to study with her in England. And she was a Transylvanian gypsy. That was her background. Romanian violinist, but her background was from Transylvania, and she comes from that long line of what we call, I think we no longer call them gypsies. They're called travelers, I think, now in Europe. Yeah, but she's from that stock. So she had the kind of romantic, just really interesting character to her playing and her teaching. It was very soulful. To me, it was like, you know, Black music when I would hear that. So I related to that kind of sound. She was also somebody who believed we could do anything, you know. There were no limits to what she taught her students to be and to do. I always look for that. I always look for people who could encourage me. And I try to do that with my own students too. I don't teach really privately that much anymore, but in terms of I teach a course in Black music history at Southern Methodist University. So that's what I try to impart to my students now, that there are no boundaries. Just keep learning and keep doing.
Tell us about the moment you learned you were going to be joining the Kansas City Symphony. What was that like for you?
Well, it was just like I'll never forget the day that I learned that I was going to be a member of the Kansas City Symphony. It was just like, oh my God, you know, how did this happen? It was just another life-changing moment. The Youth Symphony first, and then the Kansas City Symphony. And it was just, it was just like, it was like a miracle to me. And I was so grateful and so happy. But it was challenging. And at the time, you know, I mean, like, it seems like everywhere I went, I was the only African-American. Now, in the youth orchestra, there were about 4 Black kids, 4 or 5. One of them was my best friend. And then I and a couple other kids were in that group. In the Kansas City Symphony, my teacher, Leon Brady, had been a substitute player with the orchestra. You know, you'd be on call every now and then for certain concerts and whatever. But in terms of members of I don't know that there were any full-time members of the Kansas City Symphony before I came along. I'm not sure about that, but I think that that's true. I may have been, if I was the only African-American when I was there, that's for sure. So it was kind of, I was a little bit, you know, feeling a little bit alone and challenged. I mean, I enjoyed it immensely, and I didn't really feel like it was any kind of burden to be like the only Black person. That was not the thing. I just felt a little bit of the weight of that responsibility. And I probably felt it more when I left, you know, years later, you know, because I was more aware of of how other young Black people coming along would see me and look at the orchestra and see this one little brown person there. I'll never forget the day my mother took me to hear the orchestra, and I've forgotten what the occasion was, but I looked at the orchestra and I saw there were I didn't see any Black people in the orchestra, but I said to her, I'm going to be in that orchestra one day. And she just said, okay, sure. Yeah, right. That's sweet, and then I was, so at the time I didn't really think that much about race. I didn't necessarily see that as a problem. Just thought, well, nobody else wanted to do it, and here I am. I didn't think about racism that much at the time. I knew it was there. I just didn't think it applied to me for some reason. I guess in my naivete, I thought, well, I'm talented, I can do this, and people will realize that I can do it. I had no idea. And I learned the hard way because I had some moments in college and beyond where, I had some unfortunate things happen in terms of race, being denied an apartment because of being Black near campus and things like that. But at the time when I was young, much younger, I just didn't think about it. And it was not an issue for me. And nobody ever told me in my family that I couldn't do something either. No one said, you're Black, you can't do that. No one ever said that to me. So I was fearless. I just, I thought why not? I can do this. It's so important to tell young people that, you don't want them to be disillusioned and think that, and to be upset when something happens that's not in line with that kind of philosophy, because that will happen. But on the other hand, you don't want to hold them back to be limited by their own thinking against those dreams. There's a balance there. You need to encourage people, young people, but also they need to learn that there are some things that, there may be obstacles. People will try to tell you can't do things. But it's your job not to listen to them and to prove them wrong by working hard and believing in yourself and all those things.
Music wasn't the only way Rosalyn chose to tell stories. Her curiosity as a writer led her to uncover the legacy of another trailblazer, a woman whose history nearly was forgotten.
So the story of learning about Sissieretta Jones was like this. I was interviewing someone named John Hope Franklin, Dr. John Hope Franklin, who was like the dean of African American history. If you know his name, you see his books on college campuses, from slavery to freedom. At any rate, I knew about him because he was from Oklahoma, and I interviewed him. He had written a new book, and I was writing for there's a lot of complications. I was writing for the Black press, okay? So I was writing for, I was grabbing things here and there. I was writing for a Black weekly newspaper in addition to playing with the Tulsa Symphony Orchestra. I got an interview with John Hope Franklin, and we were talking about other things, his book. We got on the subject of music, and he said how much he liked music and classical music. And I said, well, I'm thinking about writing a book about Black opera singers because I'd been asked by the newspaper to write a piece about a young Black soprano whose name is Leona Mitchell. Leona Mitchell was someone who came from Oklahoma and ended up being at the Metropolitan Opera singing opposite Placido Domingo. She had been invited back to the Tulsa Opera Company. Now, the symphony played for the opera, so I was playing with the opera and the symphony. And I met her, and I wrote a story about her for the Black weekly newspaper, Oklahoma Eagle. That piece inspired me. So in interviewing John Hope Franklin, I said, I'm thinking about writing a book I met this wonderful soprano, Leona Mitchell. She's from here. I'm thinking about her story, being one of 13 kids and gospel singing family and just a talented artist and so forth. And I wonder, what's that story like? How often is that story repeated of young Black singers coming from the South, the churches, the gospel choirs, and so forth, and then suddenly realizing they have these operatic voices. So he said, you should write that book. Then he said, I'm going to introduce you to my agent, and which he did, and she became my agent. And then he said, and then of course you have to write about Sissieretta Jones. And I said, well, of course I'm going to write about Sissieretta Jones, having no clue who she was. And so then I had to go and look her up. And then I just fell in love with that story, So that became the first chapter of my book. But the whole mystery of Sissieretta Jones's life was unlocked when I was tracking down her scrapbook. I saw then the card catalog of the library that there was a dissertation written by I think it was a grandniece or somebody, Willa Daughtry was her name. And so I saw a dissertation from Syracuse University about Sissieretta Jones written by someone who was related to her. So I tracked that down and found out that her scrapbook, Sissieretta Jones's personal scrapbook of all of her press clippings and everything that happened to her that was in the paper, was in the possession of the Howard University Library, Howard University, Washington, D.C. So when I got that book contract, I took a flight to D.C. and I went to the basement of the Howard University Library and I said, I want to find something on Sissieretta Jones. And so the librarian came out with this box, this acid-free box, and the contents of it were the life of this 19th century Black opera singer who was the most famous opera singer in the country at the time, in this country, certainly of African descent, and was world famous, sang at the White House 4 times, sang at Madison Square Garden, sang all over, sang for the Queen of England, and sang for the Kaiser of Germany and just everywhere. Unfortunately, ended up going bankrupt in the 19 teens. But her life story was in that box. And so I pieced together her life story and put it and made it the first chapter of my book when I wrote, And So I Sing, African American Divas of Opera and Concert. And that's the story. That's it. Yeah.
You're both a violinist and an author. How do you navigate the creative demands of those two disciplines?
Well, it's always challenging. When I was in the middle of writing a novel, which I'm not doing now, but I hope to be doing sometime soon. But there, over the past many years, I would say 20 years, I've been writing something that was going to turn into a book, but finding the time for it, but not just the time, but also the mental space, because there is a kind of creative shift between the two disciplines of playing music. I mean, they're both creative in a sense, but they're different kinds of creativity. So music, I think of as being recreative, and writing is my composition. It's my original creation. And so they're different. Playing the violin requires, a lot of discipline and practice and all of that, but you're reading notes on a page that have been put there by someone else. And your job is to learn how to do it in a way that does justice to the music, but also to make it worthy of having your say about it, to make it your own in a way, but you have to do it within the confines of an orchestra and a section, all that stuff. When I'm doing my writing thing, the blank page is just there. It's challenging, it's intimidating. You can do whatever you want. You can start a story, somebody gets up and has breakfast and goes off to work, or someone gets up and has breakfast and discovers that there's a body somewhere. You could write anything. It's all up to you. But the challenge is, what do you write? How do you decide what to write about? So for me, because I had music in my life, I thought, well, that could be the thing that I could hang my hat on. Music is what sort of anchors the books that I've written 4 books, and every single book has a musical component to it. And I kind of start with character, a sense of place, and then also how does the music fit into it. Music is a great theme for writing, because people who like to read often like music. I've never found it to be true otherwise. And people who like music often, like reading. So no, I have no fear that if I introduce music as a theme, that I will continue to attract the person who's reading that book. And I think I can reach anybody through music. I mean, everybody has, if they don't have music in their life or haven't had it, then something is missing, and they need to be introduced to it. And so I just sort of, that kind of pushes, kind of inspires me to go on. So I kind of find, like, you show me a person and I'll just, I'll work until I find whatever kind of music applies to that person that will move them. And so on the written page, I kind of combine the two. But for me, music and writing are similar because I find that music can be very narrative. Music can tell a story. And I think the writing of a story can be like music. Words are like music, musical sounds, the alliteration, the vowels, the consonants. These are all percussive sounds and vowel sounds. There's a melody in the way you shape. There's tonality in the way you phrase that sentence, in my view. Some languages, they use music, like in Chinese, you say it in one pitch, it means something completely different in another pitch. So there's no better example of how music can shape, what the meaning of what you're saying is. So I find them very, very relatable. There's a duality in the sense that when I'm deep into learning a symphony or something like that, I cannot write very freely. I have to rest, and I have to rest my mind, and I have to go back to an empty space of my mind, uncluttered with trying to, sometimes I'll just go to bed hearing the music that I just played in an afternoon concert and I can't shake it, I'm sure everybody has that. But I have to clear out my mind. Sometimes I'll go off to a retreat. It's a place that I like to go to in Eureka Springs, Arkansas, where I can what I love about it is the silence. There's nothing, maybe an occasional bird, But there is this wonderful silence that I have to go and find. No music or no anything, just the sounds of nature and silence that I use to sort of get me from one place to another mentally. So there is that thing of having to create and the desire to write. It comes and goes. So I can't force it. I have to sort of wait for it. And usually I have to wait for it after I play, if I play something. And like, I can't come home from a week of concerts on a Sunday afternoon, which is when our concerts are over, and sit down and write. I can't do it. I have to allow some time. So I'm struggling now because of the situation in the country. It's very difficult for me to write right now because I'm just overwhelmed with what's happening. I'm very sensitive to what happens in the world. And that is sometimes that's very good because it does help me to write. I have a lot to say and a lot to think about. But in the other sense, it's sometimes difficult to get past that and get to a place of, let's sit down and write a love story. Well, that's, it's hard to do that. But I'll get past it and I'll sit down because I really want to be writing something now. I have some ideas, so I'll get back to it pretty soon. Yeah.
When the world feels heavy, what helps you cope or recenter yourself?
Well, I confide a lot in my friends. Certainly the meditation and prayer. I think meditation and prayer are pretty much one and the same. To me, they are. But it's even hard to do that sometimes. So, but what I do is I when I listen to music, it really helps a lot. I'm a big fan of jazz. And I love classical music, and opera is a passion of mine. But jazz is what I kind of go back to when I'm in the car. Like I turn on real jazz, the 67 on Sirius XM, And just the other day I was listening to some music that I thought, oh, wow, it was just a simple like jazz quartet with the tenor saxophone playing a low key kind of mid-tempo groove. And I remembered it from the first time I heard it. I thought, yeah, that's it, So that takes me away. So the music, it sounds kind of, almost trite, but music does help. And it's not necessarily classical music. It could be, but I'm so familiar and I hear so much classical music that I go to the music I don't do, jazz. And I just go there I also like the spirit of jazz, the freedom of it, and just the simplicity of it. It's complex also, but there's a simple kind of nature of jazz that's very humane, very human. and very spiritual and all of that. So that's my go-to place. I tell my kids, and when I say my kids, my students are my kids when I say that, but I tell them to find a kind of music that allows you to unpack and just gives you solace and comfort, and go there, when you're feeling low. Because I'm teaching my students about, I know you said we'll talk about this later, but at any rate, so I'm teaching the class on the history of African American music leading up to Black classical music, and how it began from the slave songs on the plantation to, oh my goodness, ragtime, minstrelsy, jazz, blues, and then eventually classical music, and then R&B and all that. But I teach my students that the reason, it's a dark story. Our history is a dark story, in this country, brought here against our will and all of this stuff. But, the Africans who came to this country came with something. They came with music and memory. And they had this connection to the spirit world, this kind of idea that they believed in something bigger than themselves. But in terms of music, they brought the rhythms that they knew, and they used that on the plantations and in the cities of America. They performed this. I teach about the Africans gathering in Congo Square on Sunday afternoon in New Orleans and making music. And when they outlawed the drums eventually in Congo Square, but what did they do? They used their body percussion. They did the ham bone, the juju, not the juju, the bambula, the dance rhythms and all of that. They created string instruments, and they played those. And then eventually after the Civil War, they found brass instruments lying around, the trumpets and the bugles from the Civil War. They played those. They didn't know how to read music. They just made up stuff. They made noises through the horn and thought, this sounds kind of cool. I think I'll just keep playing this, And when the marching band craze was over, Philip Sousa had this marching band situation of this very strict time. And then after the war was over, they wanted to celebrate. So they put a lilt in that step. They started doing syncopation and just doing a little dip in the dance because they were happy and they wanted to recreate what they learned. I do all this stuff with my kids, and I tell them, this is what got us through. This music is what got us through. And it will always get you through those dark times. You just go and put on some. I mean, if you're not a fan of Miles Davis, just forget about his behavior. The way he treated Cicely Tyson, forget about that. But just go to Kind of Blue, that recording, and Blue and Green and those old ballads. Just listen to that stuff, I challenge you not to feel something, to feel some solace there.
What is different about being a classical musician today? What are you seeing or learning these days that maybe wasn't the case 20 years ago?
The thing that I've learned just observing lately is that you don't have to be in a symphony orchestra or even be a part of a university system to be a successful classical musician if you're Black. People are just making up stuff. They're on YouTube. They're creating their own way. I mean, look at Imani Wins. I mean, look at all these groups that are happening. That people just thought, let's get together and let's do some playing and see if we can get some gigs. And then you've got a 501c3, and then you've got like dates. Now you're playing all over the world. And then people start asking for you. You've got a YouTube channel. People hear you. You got followers, Instagram. I mean, that's what young people are doing now, and they're doing other things. They're doing the symphonies too. They're doing those auditions. But from when I came along, the auditions they were expensive then. They're expensive now. But that's not the only way to have a great career and life in classical music. You can do other things. Now, I don't know that the needle has been moved too much in terms of how many Black people of color are being admitted to symphony orchestras. I know that for Asians, it looks really good. We have a lot of Asians in our orchestra, and certainly Juilliard has a lot of Asians, and they just embrace classical music, and they're excellent. Not to sound, too assigning a race to that, but yes, I know, and an orchestra has a lot of very, very fine Asian players. African Americans, I've been in that orchestra 30 some odd years. Joshua came 2 years ago. And so we'll go from 1 to 2 with Joshua, and then it'll go back to 1 until somebody else comes. But I'm hoping that will change. Around the country, it's not a lot of presence of Black people in the major symphony orchestras. There's some. Some orchestras might have 3. That's a whole lot in terms of the big 10 most successful orchestras in this country. But the numbers are small. And a lot of it is because of, I think, people choosing certainly not to go to smaller towns. They want to go where there's a, hospitable environment. They tend to go toward the big cities, the East Coast, the West Coast. So but also in the big cities they have other choices. They don't really necessarily have to do that thing. They could start their own company. They could start their own concern. And so people are doing that. The audition thing is it's only one of many things that you can do now. So it's changing, I think, that way in terms of the creative ways of making a life in music. I mean, look at Black violins, those 2 guys, look what they've done. Sphinx really was life-changing too, because the first time I went to Sphinx, actually the NAM convention, National Association of Negro Musicians, which I will also talk about to my class, formed in 1919 in Chicago. Coincidentally, the year of the Red Summer, after World War I, Black men came back from World War I. They basically caught hell from having the nerve to show up in a city square in South Carolina in an army uniform, angering white people and just making them walking into this hostility. And summer of 1919, that summer from April to November, I don't know how many, but just over a dozen riots in the country. And in Chicago, that was one of the worst ones. But they also had in 1919 the organization of the National Association of Negro Musicians, which to this day still meets. So in 1990-something, the NANM met in Dallas, Texas, and put together a Black orchestra. And I was in that orchestra from all over the country. And I never have seen so many Black instrumental players playing classical music in one place. It just brought tears to my eyes. It was just so beautiful to see. And so the next couple of years is when I got called to play in Sphinx. It was about the same people that were in the convention in Dallas in the mid-1990s showed up at the first Sphinx Orchestra roundup in Detroit. And I think it was maybe 1999. Before then, I think Sphinx should mention Aaron Dworkin's name. He's the guy who founded Sphinx as a grad student at Michigan in Ann Arbor. And he's an amazing guy and had this vision. He just said, I'm going to put together this group of, this competition for string players. I don't see string players of color often enough. So he did it. And then, so this orchestra of Black folks from around the country, different orchestras, different university rousters, so forth, came together and accompanied the competitors in this competition. And it's been happening ever since. So when I go to Sphinx and I look around, and even at the airport when you're coming in, people are coming in on flights with these French horns on their backs and the cello cases and all that, and they're Black. And you think, hey, you don't even know their names. You just, it's just a wonderful kind of like family reunion of a family you didn't even know you had. So it was like that every single year. We'd get together and we'd laugh. I mean, I've never laughed so much in a rehearsal, but just out of sheer joy of seeing so many folks who looked like me. And the same thing with Gateways. Now, I've only done Gateways once. Looking forward to it again this April, but the same thing, Now, Sphinx is African Americans and Latinos. Gateways is a pretty much African diaspora orchestra. So they're very different, but they serve this purpose of introducing classical music and supporting classical music, the people who want to do classical music who are of color. And it's great. It's a wonderful, I hope it goes on. Hope it never ends.
The The Black Music Scene podcast was written and produced by David Norville. Special thanks to Ace Productions for their help on this episode. The Black Orchestral Network is sponsored by the Gateways Music Festival and generously supported by the Mellon Foundation and the New York State Council on the Arts. The Black Music Scene podcast is a product of the Black Orchestral Network, where our mission is to cultivate community, lift our voices, and tell our stories. If you'd like to get involved and support the Black Orchestral Network, please visit blackorchestralnetwork.org. Thank you so much for listening, and see you next time.